Today we're going to take a look at an introduction to the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era is a time in history about the same time we've been talking about with industrialization and urbanization, late 1800s, early 1900s. So we're kind of in the same time frame that we've been going over. We're just going to take a little different look at it today. I always like to start out with this cartoon. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Progressive Era, but I like the cartoon and it'll tell you a little bit about history. Get it. Okay. All right, so first question for you. Was city life dangerous at the turn of the century? Explain why or why not. And should the government try to fix America's problems? I'll give you a second to answer that. All right, so if we take a look at progressivism, progressive sort of means forward thinking, looking forward. And we know that there's a lot of corruption. We know that working conditions and living conditions are terrible for lower income immigrants. And so the big goal of the progressives is to try to make life better for those people, to return control of the government from the wealthy elites to the people. So you've got the cartoon Standard Oil and wearing on his crown, he's got the railroads that he owns and just lots of money and lots of gold. And that shows the corruption of the robber barons and the politicians at the time. And so progressivism is all about bringing control back to the people, bringing control of the government back to the people, and giving people truly an economic opportunity, a chance to live the American dream. For the most part in this time period, the American dream kind of died off once people got to America because most people didn't have that rags to riches experience, at least not after about the 1890s-ish. And so the goal of the progressives is to try to bring that back. And then also to correct the injustices. So we know that there's so much inequality in the system. We know we can't make everything perfect, but to try to make it at least a little bit better is another goal of the progressives. So we can divide the progressives up. There are three different types of progressives. There are some progressives considered social justice. They're on trying to make life a little bit more fair. There are economic progressives. They want to, of course, even out the economic conditions between the rich and the poor. Not necessarily equality, but at least making things a little more even. And then finally, we've got the political reforms. There are some progressives who think that the political system and the political machine is way too corrupt, and they want to fix that. Throughout the course of this unit, we're going to go through each of these in a whole lot of detail. We'll spend probably a whole day on each one, but just to give you an overview, these are the three different types of progressives. Now, if we want to divide the progressives up, we can talk about four goals for the progressives, things that are carried out by all progressives. So goal number one, to protect social welfare. We know that life is pretty nasty. We know that living conditions aren't very nice. We know that there's a lot of problems with the urban poor. We know that living in tenements, terrible conditions. We know that working conditions kind of stink. And so the first goal of the progressives is to try to make some of these things better, try to improve some of these things. And one way that they tried to improve conditions were through what are known as a settlement house. Most famous is run by a lady named Jane Addams, but settlement houses were essentially these places where the rich would try to teach the poor how to live better lives. Sometimes they would live together in the same communities and in the same neighborhoods. Other times it would just be a house like the Hall House in Chicago, where people could go and they'd live and they would learn. These were almost like community centers. They were places where people could go and learn how to speak English, learn how to cook, get a pretty decent place to stay that was, well, not luxurious, not exactly the horrible conditions of tenement either. And so settlement houses tried to really serve as the center of communities, serve as a way to tie people together and bring people together in a way that wasn't happening much anymore. With this huge divide between the rich and the poor, we see that communities are more and more divided, and so the idea of settlement houses is bringing people together. Settlement houses also sometimes act like churches, so it's a place to go and worship. It's also a place that would provide many community services for the people. Yes, the YMCA was another example of a way to try to protect social welfare. In the photo, you'll see some of the things that YMCAs provide, things like libraries, classes, pools, ways for the community to really come together. So not quite a settlement house, but the same idea, bringing people together in order to protect their rights and give them better living conditions. You see in the photo one of the earliest YMCAs in the United States, and if you go on the plus a trip to Washington, D.C., we'll take a look at that. We'll go to the community, the U Street community, and check out that particular building. Other things that come about to protect social welfare: the Salvation Army. You may know them as the bell ringers around Christmas time, but back in the day they had what were called slum brigades. They firmly believed that one of the reasons why people were poor is because they drank a lot of alcohol and that they just didn't know how to work hard enough. And so what the slum brigades would do is they would go around and they go to the poor areas, they would find the urban poor, and they would teach them how to work hard and try to get them not to drink alcohol in order to improve their lives. They also set up soup kitchens, so if you did fall on hard times, you could go get a decent meal and be taken care of. You didn't have to worry about that. Goal number 2 of the progressives: moral improvement. We just mentioned that a lot of people in the progressive era thought that alcohol was the root of all evil, that in order to help the conditions of the poor, you had to make them moral. You had to improve the living conditions for poor by improving personal behavior. And if alcohol is one of those things, as well as many other immoral things like gambling and prostitution, if you could eliminate those immoral behaviors, if we could improve personal behavior of people, then there was a firm belief that life and conditions for many immigrants would improve. Goal number 3, economic reform. So we know that there's a lot of inequality and injustice in society, and Americans are starting to question, what should the government do? What is the role of the government in the economic system? We used to hear about the American dream, and we've seen that the American dream isn't such a dream anymore. That the rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poorer. There's not much opportunity for the poor to move up to the rich. We see a hierarchy that looks something like this. Take a look at this cartoon, the pyramid of the capitalist system. So at the bottom, we've got the workers, we've got the laborers, and we eat for you, of course, wealthy people. We shoot at you, military is run by the wealthy people. We fool you. There was a lot of skepticism around some religions at the time. We rule you, the robber barons. And of course, capitalism, the money at the top of the spectrum. And so there is this big idea of inequality between the rich and the poor and the abuses of the poor. And so a lot of Americans were beginning to question, is this really the American dream? Is this really why I came to this country? Is this what I'm really trying to achieve? And so they wanted to create a more fair economic system. Many, and not everybody, and actually this is maybe a small amount of people, but there were some people who had issues with capitalism, with the idea of the free markets. And so a lot of people believe that there was an uneven balance between businesses and workers. Businesses were just taking advantage of workers, and of course we know that with the political machine and with other corruption in the government rules favor big business. They're there to protect businesses and not to protect workers, and this is seen as a major flaw of the social system at the time. So the solution, and this was only proposed by a small percentage of people, it wasn't a very popular part of the progressive movement, but it did catch on in some circles, the idea of socialism, the idea that the government should provide for the people. Now, I think it's important to note that most progressives were not socialists. Most progressives didn't go that far, and so most progressives tried to distance themselves as that was seen as un-American. But they did agree that this inequality between the rich and the poor and the abuses of workers by businesses was part of the problem, and they did want to find solutions to that problem. So probably the most famous socialist, the guy named Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs would run for president on a number of occasions. He ran for the American Socialist Party. I bet you probably didn't even know the American Socialist Party existed. And Eugene Debs also becomes a big leader in the union movement. So when it comes to labor leader, when we talk about labor, we're talking really about labor unions. So not only did he run for president of the United States, but he was also a big union guy, head of a major union. Other parts of economic reforms come from the form of muckrakers. We'll talk about muckrakers, but muckrakers are essentially journalists who try to dig up the dirt. They try to find some of the unethical things going on in places like meat packaging plants. And so Upton Sinclair is probably the most famous. He wrote a book called The Jungle, and he talked about how dirty and nasty meat packaging plants were. We're actually going to read a passage from The Jungle, and, well, you'll see for yourself. Economic reforms also worked on limiting government corruption, particularly limiting monopolies. So that doesn't mean we want to get rid of everything in government, but we do want to put limits on monopolies. We believe that there are far too many people who don't have a say in their own government, who don't have control of the government, and monopolies limit competition, and many times, in many cases, the government actually supports these monopolies. And so there's a big push to put an end to monopolies. And then goal number 4, foster efficiency. Both in the economy and in the government, we want to use science and logic and reason, the Enlightenment, and the scientific method to try to improve lives of people. And so probably the most famous person who did this from this area, Henry Ford. When Henry Ford brought about the idea of the assembly line or paying his workers $5 a day, that was one way of improving efficiency within the economy, trying to make life a little bit better for people. There were other ways, of course, to try to make the system more efficient, but these were some of the basic ones that we looked at. And then we get to the idea of social reform of progressives. There were a lot of concerns at the state level, things that needed to be improved in the states, like how can we regulate railroads so they don't get a monopoly, so they don't get too big? How can we make working conditions safer in the mining industry? How can we make the mills, whether it be steel mills or other types of mills, a little bit safer? How do we use the telegraph to sort of improve living conditions? How do we make life better for people in all conditions? So I'm going to pose the question to you. We've talked about the political continuum, the idea of change. I want to know, where do you think the progressives would fall? Would they be A, radicals, B, liberals, C, conservatives, or D, reactionaries? Well, remember, radicals want a lot of change, liberals want some change, conservatives want things to stay the same, and reactionaries want to go back to the good old days. So if we look at this, of course, progressives are probably radicals or maybe liberals. They're people who want to change society. And so if we look at progressivism, again, this idea of changing society, that's where the progressives fall. So we'll spend some more time examining the progressives. We'll go section by section through some of the different reforms that they did and how they carried them out, but more on that as we break things down later in the year, later in the unit. For now, we just wanted to give you a basic overview of what we're looking at and the different types of progressives out there. Have a wonderful evening.